and I'm sure, at least with verse 1, many of y'all could cite it from memory, whether it be from King James or something else. So we'll go ahead and read it. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." So, keep it there. We're going to be looking at it today. I wanted to offer another theme. Each week we've looked at least one theme of Genesis. I think this will be the last theme. We'll actually talk about it more Sunday nights. The theme of food. We got a hint of it with fruit, but let me quickly show you in Genesis food. Obviously starts in Genesis 1 with plants and humans. But then in Genesis 3 is, you eat of the tree of good and the tree of bad, right? So you have the emphasis on food, but notice that food becomes a picture of temptation. Among other things, it's kind of the key. So you get food shows up again with the Cain and Abel story. One sacrifice is accepted, the other is rejected. One is an animal, the other is fruit of the ground. The Noah story has to do with food. There's 7 of every clean animal for the purpose of food, particularly after the ark. Man can eat meat now, so we're all carnivores to the glory of God. And then later, the story of Isaac and Esau. Why does Esau give up his birthright? He does it because he needs a bowl of soup. So you're seeing a theme regarding food, and food becomes a metaphor for desire. Right? It's our appetite. So we'll see this Sunday night when we look at the issue of greed, because Paul uses the language of cravings. Our appetites is a way to describe our lust and our greed and whatnot. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but let's look at Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. Remember what we said last week? The key to interpreting verses 1 and 2 among more broadly, your view of creation comes down to how old do you think the earth is? Is it an old earth, young earth? And secondly, is the first 2 verses a prologue? They're introducing you to the story, getting you ready, or is it part of the narrative itself? So when you read, "In the beginning God created the heavens and earth," is that the beginning of the story? Or is Moses saying, here's basically what's going to happen. God's going to create the heavens and earth. He's going to create everything. Now let me show you how it's done. I lean towards prologue, but I can be convinced otherwise, right? Saying that will affect the conclusion you have on the issue of creation. But with that said, let's break this down a little bit. Let's start with beginning, right? In the beginning. See, we're 3 words into this, and it's going to take us a little while to get past the word 3. That word is a significant word, as you can imagine. I don't want to insult your intelligence, but that phrase implies there was a beginning, right? I'm sure you could figure that out on your own, even if you did graduate from Owen County Public Schools. But don't miss the significance of that phrase right there. That there was a time when there wasn't time, right? That is significant. By the way, that was rejected by virtually everybody until the 40s, 50s, 60s. And here comes the Bible, who for centuries, millennia, has said, no, there was a time when there wasn't time. There was a time when there was nothing except God himself, as we'll see. But there was a beginning of everything. So this comes down to 2 issues. One was the popular view among scientists known as eternalism. And then we'll look at the road the Big Bang has there. So start with eternalism. Eternalism is to say that there are some things in the universe that have always been there. Hydrogen, helium, whatever, okay? So you have to explain, where did all of this stuff come from? Your options are limited. Either there was a time when they were here, and when you make that argument, there has to be someone outside of the universe, outside of the physical space, who does it, okay? So if there's a beginning, there has to be a beginner. If there's creation, there's a creator, right? Or if you hold that matter itself is eternal, it has always been around, that opens the door to a lot of things. One of the things that opens the door is you no longer need God. Because now you believe in something or someone that is eternal, and it isn't Yahweh. You see the significance of this. And why, until recent history, the predominant view of Darwinian scientists, which is the scientific community, held to eternalism. In the helpful book, it's called 40 Questions About Creation and Evolution. It's probably my favorite book on the issue of origins. He writes, eternalism played a crucial role in the arguments made for Darwinism by its early advocates. Darwinists conceded that the odds of something as complex as living beings coming about by random chance were extremely low, even minuscule. Now, we all agree on that, okay? One of the problems with Darwinism is you have to explain, how did we go from rocks and dirt and water to living, breathing, reproducing organisms? Okay? Now, I would say you can give that an eternity, an infinite amount of time. And a rock is going to stay a rock. Right? Water is going to still be H2O. Right? You've got to explain that. That's a huge problem for Darwinism. So when Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species, he never gave the origins, he presumed it. You began with all these species, and then evolution took over. Well, you got to, where them things come from, right? Right? And so the origin of the species was never given. Well, eternalism is an attractive option here because now you have an infinite amount of time. It goes on. However, if the cosmos is eternal, then it does not matter how unlikely an event may be. Given an infinite amount of time, if an event has any possibility of happening at all, no matter how remote, the inevitability of it will happen. Think about it. Maybe you're just terrible at shooting a basketball. Okay? But if you were given an infinite amount of tries, I bet you can sink one from half court. Now, the fact that it's unlikely for you to hit a shot doesn't mean you won't hit a shot if you're given an eternal amount of chances. So, too, if it's unlikely that we crawled out of a cesspool somewhere in the past, well, yeah, we all agree it's unlikely. But if you have an infinite amount of time, eventually you're going to win the lottery, the cosmic lottery. Right? And that was the argument of Darwin. I think I got one more line here. In an everlasting universe, it does not matter how many multiplied trillions of years it might take. Notice, now we're talking about trillions, not just billions. Eventually, every possible scenario will get its day. We are here, so obviously our existence is possible. Therefore, concludes the Darwinists, as absurdly improbable as it is, an eternal and infinite universe renders our evolution inevitable. So at some point, it's going to happen. Right? So this was the predominant view rooted in the philosophy of eternalism. That's significant. When you're looking at much of science, there's a philosophical presupposition driving the science. Here, it is eternalism. Of course, evolution can happen because we've always been around. Something has always been around. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that we now know better. And that's the issue of, let me just add this. If you're a comic book fan, you like superheroes, this is DC, because I like DC better than Marvel, and y'all can hate me later. This is known as the multiverse. Marvel has one, DC Comics. I know you're thinking, what in the world are we talking about? Exactly. It's a fictional idea made by superhero storybook stories. Okay, and basically is we've got our universe, but somewhere out there is a whole other universe, and there's another me out there. But in this me, I'm a farmer who wears bib overalls and steel-toe boots and Carhartt jackets, right? Everything's possible in infinite universes. I mean, in another universe, I'm a president of the United States. I mean, as unlikely that is, right? Well, that's fun to do when you talk about superheroes, okay? This is growing in popularity among actual scientists. Because the more we study, say, the cell, let alone the cosmos, the more we realize how unlikely it is for order to come out of chaos. So, how can we explain that? Well, what if there were an infinite number of possible universes? Then you're playing the lottery again. One of them is going to work out. You just need one to work out, and it happens to be ours. That is a form of eternalism. You have to explain this stuff without God, and thus you have to have something that begins everything. But if there isn't a beginning, then you can explain everything. The problem is that we know better now, and this is why we've gone to the multiverse sort of idea. And this is growing it's a growing theory. The problem is there's no evidence of it. None. It's just a theory. and yet people presume it to be true because scientists have a philosophical motivation behind things. And that leads to the Big Bang. We've all heard of the Big Bang. We should note, first of all, that the Big Bang was a term of derision initially because scientists held to eternalism, so they had to reject the idea of a beginning. Remember, if there is a beginning, then there has to be someone outside of the story to make it, to get it going, right? Someone's got to push the cart down the hill, okay? So I started reading Lord of the Rings again, but in The Hobbit, the prequel, I guess you can say, the first line is something like, there once lived a hobbit in a hole, something like that. Well, we know there's a hobbit there because Tolkien, who is outside of the story, put him there, okay? So too, if there is a beginning, you've got to have someone to light the match. You've got to have something outside of the system who's bigger and over the system and not controlled by it. That's why the Big Bang really threw things for a loop. Big Bang begins around 1916 with a guy, little known guy, let me see if you've heard of him, named Albert Einstein. I don't hear anyone complain about my hair, right? If you see a picture of Albert Einstein, I don't hear any complaints. God can use people with bad hair. So Albert Einstein took his theory of general relativity and he applied it to the beginning of the universe. And he began to postulate that if the theory of general relativity is true, there must be a beginning of the universe. Remember, no one held to this other than Christians reading their Bible. Later, in 1930, another guy, perhaps you've heard of something named after him, Edwin Hubble, he discovered that the cosmos was expanding. Okay? So if you were to, say it's snow outside, and you took a snowball, threw it up, and you hit it with a bat, what's going to happen with that snow? It's going to break into a bunch of pieces, and it's going to just keep going until Newton's law takes over. Okay? But imagine it's just going to keep going. If you were to take each piece of that snowball in 1,000 pieces, you could, in theory, because it's expanding out, postulate it had an origin, right? So if you can see in the universe that it's actually expanding, we are right now just flying through the universe, right? We're not stationary in the same loop. We're looping around the sun, but we're also looping, and we keep moving throughout the universe, right? So if that's the case, and you're seeing this throughout the entire cosmos, then it's evidence enough that there was a time when there was a common starting place, right? And so Hubble comes around and through his telescopes and stuff does that. By the 1960s, the Big Bang becomes the predominant worldview of scientists as it is today. This is from the same book. Robert Jastrow recounts how most physicists and astronomers initially were hostile to the Big Bang theory. In fact, the expression Big Bang was a term of derision coined by astronomer Fred Hoyle, who remained a lifelong proponent of eternalism. He died in his grave rejecting it for philosophical reasons. Astronomer Arthur Eddington declared in 1931, quote, "The notion of a beginning is repugnant to me." Chemist Walter something argued that adherence to eternalism was necessary when he wrote, quote, "To deny the infinite duration of time would be to betray the very foundation of science." Joshua points out that such opposition was motivated by philosophical presupposition rather than scientific evidence. This is persistent in science, right? That we have certain things we believe, and we will only promote the things that support our belief. We're doing it now with the intelligent design issue. You have to reject intelligent design because I immediately presume there is no God. Well, how about we don't make those presuppositions? If you can't prove there's a God, then stop saying you can't allow God in science because you can't prove there's not a God scientifically, okay? So why are you limiting yourself with this? Go where the evidence takes you. So that phrase beginning is vital. So everything has its beginning right here in this story, in the beginning, including time. When you can grasp that idea, not only can you understand the difference between that God is infinite and God is eternal, but now you can understand the idea of eternal life. God isn't bound by time. You can also understand how God, who is outside of time, which if you think about that too much, you'll find under your bed, sucking your thumb, in a fetal position, reciting the Greek alphabet backwards, right? But if God is outside of time, he can speak of the future as if it's the present. He can speak of the past as if it's the present. And all that sort of stuff. Because it's consistent with with that. So, in the beginning, God. 4 words into this. You lost yet? In the beginning, God. Well, we need to know here that the Bible does promote a type of eternalism. It's God himself. So outside of space and time is a dude named God, right? We don't believe in the eternal nature of material, but we believe in the eternal nature of God. Prior to the beginning, there was God and God alone. And remember, this is a unique message, not just in the history of science, but in the pagan world that Judaism was born out of. They're the only people arguing there's one God. You see that there's one God here, and they're the only ones arguing that that God is the origin of everything. That is a radical message given the Egyptian context, the Sumerian context, the ancient Near East context, the Canaanite context, everything else at the time of Moses. Most pagan cultures believe that creation, which you see, is the collaboration of multiple gods. Most have said, no, there's just one. By the way, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I think we get the point. But so far, this should sound familiar because in the New Testament, we have another creation story, right? It's John 1. What does it say? In the beginning was the Word. What did John just do? Whatever this Word is, whoever this Word is, the Logos, is God. We don't know anything else about the story of John. But he's replaced the word God, Elohim, with Logos. Now, in verse 14 of John 1, we discover that the Logos, Creator, put on flesh, dwelt among us, we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten Son. He tabernacled is the word in John 1:14. He tabernacled. He pitched his tent among us. It's a great, great Greek he has there. But notice that the emphasis is on creation. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. There at creation, the Word was God. He is God, right? It's both and. You have the distinction within the Trinity, and you have the unity of the Godhead. Both are right there in the very first verse, unless you're a Jehovah's Witness and you just make up your own translation. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him, that is the Logos, was life. Life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness. Darkness has not overcome. That's the first 5 verses. Do you see some of the parallels with what you have in the first 5 verses and the first chapter of Genesis? Light, darkness, life, all of that. And what John does in John chapter 1 is it's a type of creation story in terms of the gospel, the story of Jesus and how he saves the cosmos. So in chapter 1 of John, he's going to emphasize 4 things about Jesus. He's Logos, he's light, he's life, and he's going to add to the creation story that he's Lamb. It's going to be his emphasis in John chapter 1. It's a type of creation story. If you grasp John chapter 1, the rest of the story will make sense. And furthermore, it proves the point that Jesus, who is creator, is now redeemer. And they're the same thing that happens there. God brings light out of darkness. He did it in creation, as we'll see, maybe. And then he therefore he brings life out of death. Let me see if I illustrate this. I know I've talked a lot about A Christmas Carol in recent past 2 months. We did the sermon series last month. But just so happens I'm teaching a literature class for a bunch of high schoolers, homeschool high schoolers. And the first book we did was Christmas Carol. I am tired of the Christmas Carol. I'll be honest. I've read the book 3 times, watched about 4 different versions, maybe 5. I'm just done with it. All right? But it's interesting. There's a great scene in there. Tiny Tim, right, is brought home by Bob Cratchit, right? So this is a Christmas present, and he's seeing the Cratchits, and Tiny Tim's just excited. And Bob Cratchit makes a big deal. Remember, he picks Tiny Tim up from church. And Tiny Tim makes the comment that he hopes people sees him in church so that they'll remember that the Jesus they worship is the guy who makes the lame walk and the blind see. Now, initially we see that as a reference to Tiny Tim, because by the end of it, Tiny Tim isn't lame anymore thanks to Ebenezer Scrooge. Right? But at the time, we know Tiny Tim's going to die. Christmas present tells us that. So it's not about Tiny Tim. Who is it about? People like Scrooge. The whole story is about conversion, right? So there's a question: is the conversion of Scrooge secular or religious? That's not the point here. But you see that Tiny Tim gets the idea. The God who creates even the lame is the God who saves the wicked of heart, like the miser Scrooge. It's a beautiful picture that Dickens presents for us, and that's what you're getting in John's gospel. So in the beginning, God created. Now we're 5 words into this. We may not get to verse 2. Okay. In the beginning, God created. That word is significant. Hebrew is a pretty straightforward language. It's not as complicated as English, where we have a thing called a thesaurus. For those in Owen County, I do know that dinosaurs are dead. We're not talking about the Jurassic Park, okay? So you can have a word, and there'd be 24 other options for you to choose from. And you can usually tell the vocabulary of a good writer, right? If he's a good writer, she's a good writer, she's got a good vocabulary. Okay? Hebrew, you don't really have that. Much more limited vocabulary. Greek's similar in that way. Although classical Greek is more complicated. So you really have 2 words to choose from in this 5th word. In the beginning, God created. And the word you choose will determine your theology. Does Moses choose bara, or does he choose asa? Well, not that you care, right? I mean, it's Hebrew. It's all Greek to me, right? This is the word you'll find in Hebrew. Now, why is that significant? Because although either word could be used, they both have similar but 2 very different meanings. Bara means to create outside of anything else. In the Old Testament, bara is only used in application to God. It's a divine attribute. Now, you don't always translate it as created, right? Because context determines translation. But it's always applied to God. I didn't take the time to give you a bunch of examples. It's all over Genesis 1 and in chapter 2 and stuff. But there's plenty of examples of bara applying to the attributes of God. You can do a concordance search on Google or get you out Old Strong Concordance. You'll see some of this. Some are more mysterious than others, but you'll find ultimately they're all divine attributes. So here's an example. In the beginning, bara. So by creation, God created out of nothing. Have you or I ever done that? No. My wife is an artist. And she's a very gifted artist. I'm very proud of her. Last night, I went down to Owen County, paradise of God, and went to the public library, and my wife and 2 kids did a paint class. Now, you all have seen what my wife can do in terms of art. It's just incredible. She's painting a clothespin. For you millennials, just Google it. And so that's like primary school art for my wife. She didn't finish it. She goes, you'd be surprised how fast an hour of painting will go by. I'm like, I would be surprised. I didn't tell her that, right? And her painting didn't look like anyone else's. She does this all the time. Everyone else had like a yellow background because that's what the rules were. She had a gray background because she thought it accented the clothespin better. Whatever. And she's telling me everything that the teacher got wrong. Anyways, so she paints this or whatever it is she's painting. The kids do it. My mother-in-law does it. And then like my niece does it, all that sort of stuff. They did not say, okay, clothespin on a canvas. Boom. There it is, right? They didn't do that, did they? There had to be a canvas. There had to be paint. Had to be brushes. Had to be a clothespin to serve as a model. All that sort of stuff. When my dad fixed up that awesome Camaro back in the day, he started with a junk Camaro, right? I remember him driving that thing back, and it was a miracle he got out of the guy's driveway with it. But you have to start with something. So in other words, we asa things. We make things. To make implies previous material. Right? These pews weren't just created out of thin air. They came when a tree was cut down. Take that, you liberals out of California, right? We make things as humans. So now you will get this attributed to God sometimes. Let me give you a great example, and it'll show you the difference between bara, in the beginning God bara, and asa. Genesis 3:21, the Lord God asa. For Adam and his wife, garments of skin clothed them. Did God create? No. They had already been created. This is the key to atonement in Genesis chapter 3, isn't it? That God takes that which is already there, and it becomes a means of covering the shame and sin and guilt of the sinner. After all, isn't that what he did with his son? God didn't create the son, but through the son offered to us as a sacrifice. It's a huge difference between bara and asa. So eternalism will say asa, if you will, because you always had this stuff, and out of that everything else was made. But we believe the opposite, that in fact God created out of nothing. This is consistent with the Bible. By faith, Hebrews 11, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the Word of God, the idea of God speaking. We'll see that hopefully next week. So that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. The emphasis is there. That God spoken it into existence. Psalm 33, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made. Again, notice the emphasis on God speaking. Revelation, all their hosts of the breath of his mouth, for he spoke and it came to be, he commanded and it stood forth. It wasn't out of previous material. That's what the pagans believed. Colossians 1, for in him all things were created. This is Jesus, by the way. In heaven and earth, visible and invisible, were the thrones, dominions, principalities, and authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Both are true. Through him came all creation. It was ultimately for him all of creation is. It's for his glory. You notice all things, visible, invisible, whatnot. Revelation 4:11. Remember, Revelation 4 is about worshiping God as creator. Chapter 5, worshiping God as redeemer. You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. We call this fancy term, you see there at the top, ex nihilo, out of nothing. I think that's key to the biblical doctrine of creation. And that's vital to our understanding of really our worldview. Everything has its origin in God. Let me see if I can give you an example of this, why it's practical. What does the Declaration of Independence say? We are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights. Where did that come from? Right here. Rights do not come from the governments. They come from God. Which is where you get the idea, there's really a Christian idea that's been articulated, that is resistance. That was a Reformation idea. What do you do when the government is your enemy? And the Protestants started to develop a theology of resistance. How do you resist while still being peacemakers? That's more complicated what we can get into. But it begins right here. If God created everything, he created the idea of rights. That's bigger than government, because God created government. The government itself should submit itself to God. Everything. What is our understanding of human nature and human rights? It all comes right here. We didn't come out of primordial soup. We came from God. Our view of the earth, the body, everything, right here. Because God created out of nothing, thus he is Lord over everything. This is a vital, vital key to the Bible. Let me quickly, heavens and the earth. This is the totality of creation. Remember that pagans believed each God created a certain part. The sea, the land, the animals, family and reproduction, stuff like that. So I want, if we can, I want to look at verse 2, okay? Verse 2, I have yet to figure out completely. So if you can fix anything for me, I would greatly appreciate it. Let me show you just a few things. I do think verse 2 is a real mystery. Remember that in the cultural backdrop is significant here, verse 2. The creation stories of the pagan culture is they take chaos and they show how the gods manipulate chaos. So if a god is happy, then maybe that bad storm won't happen. He manipulated chaos. But if the god isn't happy, he'll pull back and you get chaos. So in the pagan worldview, chaos is the order of the day. In the Mosaic worldview, it's the opposite. There was chaos, but the Lord brought order out of it. Right? By the way, that's evolution, isn't it? The opposite of evolution? It's pagan. Evolution says you get order out of chaos. Therefore, we always have chaos because we haven't got order yet. Evolution stops the second you get order. There's nothing else to evolve. So you have to have chaos. All right? So chaos is a necessary step for progressive evolution. It's paganism, pure and simple. I guess it comes from the same heart. So with that as a background, everything, the earth was without form and void. The emphasis here is not that there was matter that God manipulated. That's not what is being said here. He's saying rather that God brings that order out of chaos. So you begin with, there's no form or order to things. God is beginning creation. There's no form of order. But what does God do by the end of the story? He brings order out of that chaos. I'm hoping you can already see where this is going in the Bible. Because everything in the Bible has already been set up for us. Right here in the beginning, you've got chaos, and God is drawing order out of it. The real language here speaks of, it's not the earth itself wasn't functionable for humanity at this time. It speaks of function more than anything. But the best we can do in English is without form and void, right? There isn't anything, you can't just put Adam there because he's just going to fall to the cosmos or something, okay? So without form and void, darkness was over the face of the deep. Notice what is lacking here, light. So the next verse starts with, and the Lord God said, let there be light. So you see again, the emphasis is you've got chaos and you've got darkness. But what does God do with this? He draws out of it light and order. So darkness is important. The Spirit of God. There's some debate here. The word spirit in Greek and Hebrew is the word wind and breath. I'll give you an example of this. You go home, I want you to read this. John chapter 3. Right before the famous John 3:16. Remember what Jesus tells Nicodemus? He's trying to explain what it means to be born again. And he speaks of no one knows where the wind blows, where it comes from. It's pneuma, the wind. No one knows the spirit, the work of the Spirit of God. That's pneuma, spirit. He purposely plays with that word that it has multiple applications. So the question here is, should we translate this and the Holy Spirit was hovering over the earth, or is it that God used a mighty wind, a supernatural wind? I don't know. I think this is right, but it's more complicated than just because it's King James doesn't mean it's always right. We know it 99% is, but you can see in the Hebrew. I wonder if Moses is kind of playing with the words there. So the Spirit of God. Last thing, hovering over the face of the deep. This word is rather limited in meaning. You can't really translate it much other ways. But I think what we're meant to see here is God actively involved in creation. Now this is a problem with theistic evolution. Remember it from last week. Theistic evolution says God lit the match and he looked back and he said, let's see how this thing turns out, right? How big is this firework going to be? I think this language suggests that God is actively a participant in his creation. He's a lawgiver. He's a great artist. Right? So just as my wife is man, an hour goes by really fast because she's really into coloring with brushes, right? She's hovering over that. She's very engaged. I think that's what we're getting here. It's not just that God took what was formless and void and he said, let's see if we can make something out of this. Rather, he is very much involved. Now, I hope by now you can see the application from verses 1 and 2, right? Not only do we have a right theology of God, but verse 2, we're seeing how the Bible will unfold. There's nothing surprising in the rest of the Bible that you don't see in the first 2 verses, is there? Does God in the Bible bring order out of chaos? That's the whole story, right? Think about it. In the garden, when you have sin, what's the story? Chaos. And it's illustrated in Cain and Abel. It gets worse with their descendants because the sons of God meets with the daughters of men, and there's Nephilim, the men of renown, and God says, what am I going to do? I wish I hadn't made all these people. But he found grace in the eyes of Noah. He brings order out of what is clearly chaos. Remember, the boat is a type of timber. Right? And then you get the Tower of Babel. You've got to have another creation story. And what does he do? He chooses not to work with all of mankind, but one tribe of mankind, so that through them all the nations will be blessed. So he says, out of this chaos of humanity from the Tower of Babel, I will bring order with this tribe. And that's the story of the Old Testament. Guess what keeps happening in the Old Testament? Chaos in Israel. Pick a page in the Old Testament, you'll find it. It's all over the place, right? But we get stories that bring order out of that chaos. Goliath is screaming, right? And he's mocking the people of God. And thus he's mocking God. What does David do? Who's this guy? And through a slingshot, which I'm sure the American government, or at least in Virginia, they'll start banning slingshots after this event. That's a nice little Second Amendment joke for you, right? He brings order out of chaos, and David becomes king. The Persians come. The Babylonians come, the Syrians, and then the Babylonians come. And what do? They bring chaos. But what does God do out of that? He brings order. That's why a book like Haggai is so important, right? Because Haggai says, look, what is important is that now that we've returned to the promised land, We build a temple, a place to worship the God who brought order out of that chaos. What's Habakkuk all about? I see that the Babylonians are coming, and they're going to come kill us, and it's going to be awful. How can you let this happen? How does it end? God to bring order out of chaos. What's the story of Jesus? He heals the sick, opens the eyes of the blind, he raises the dead, he dies upon a cross. And in his resurrection, he brings order out of chaos. What is the church supposed to be? We'll see this Sunday morning from Philippians 2. In Philippians 2, he'll say, do everything without complaining and arguing, so that you'll be lights among a crooked generation. Chaos is the world. Order is where you see the creation of God. What is Revelation all about, right? This world is a mess. But when Christ comes, he'll bring order out of that chaos. It's right here in the second verse of the Bible, right there. And how is that illustrated? Light and darkness. That theme runs throughout the Bible as well, constantly. I'll give you a perfect example of this. Go back to John chapter 3. At what time of day does Nicodemus come to Jesus? Nighttime. Is it literally nighttime or is it literally nighttime? The answer, I think, is yes. What is Nicodemus starting to see? If you follow the story of Nicodemus, every time he shows up, he's starting to see a little bit more light. So that by the resurrection, there he is. And what is it that John tells us about Jesus? He told us in John chapter 1, he told us later. Jesus is the light of the world. We know he's the light of the world. Why? In John chapter 9, he opens the eyes of the blind. Is this making sense? This is so important to grab. And it's right here in the first two verses, the entirety of the Bible. Right? So I can't explain to you all the intricacies of verse 2, but I can give you the theology of it, and it's beautiful. This is the God we worship, and it's why creation is important, because without creation, we don't understand the gospel. I'm exhausted. Anything I can dodge? I think it'll move faster after this. All right? So, maybe we'll get through the 6 days of creation next week. Or maybe we'll just make it to verse 3. I don't know. But I hope this is helpful for you guys. I love it. It is so helpful for me. And it's so good to see that at the microcosm, you get the macrocosm. It is just so helpful. And it encourages me in my own faith. So, all right. If you guys don't have anything, we're going to log off here. So, see everybody. And then...